The unthinkable happens as Mattel Electronics arrives on the Atari VCS. For a very long time, the idea of a major video game hardware company publishing games and competing systems was unthinkable. That has changed in recent years with Sony and Microsoft games showing up on computers and other consoles, but it has never been exactly a common approach. And yet, as we'll see in the next couple videos, that dam first broke towards the end of July 1982 when the first games from Mattel Electronics' M Network line of VCS releases first started reaching stores. The M Network story is convoluted and messy, with competing stories on how it came about. The recently released book Intellivision: How a Video Game System Battled Atari and Almost Bankrupted Barbie by Tom Bolstorff and Braxton Soderman delves deeply into the history of Mattel Electronics, including ample coverage of this side of the story as well. I'll be pulling from their research here, as well as details I was able to pull together myself, but I definitely encourage checking out their work if Mattel's game history interests you. I did have the opportunity to interview Mike Depke, the former director of marketing and software for the M Network, who was with Mattel Electronics until it closed its doors in early 1984. I'll be pulling from that too. While Mattel's Intellivision was the number 2 system on the market from its broad release in 1980 through 1982, that kind of statement doesn't quite tell the whole story. To use a more recent analogy, it would be akin to saying the PlayStation 5 is the number 2 game console on the market after the Nintendo Switch, which has outsold it as of this recording by something on the order of 90 million units. By March 1982, Atari controlled approximately 70 to 75% of the video game market in terms of sales revenue and had millions more VCS units in people's homes than Mattel had even produced in televisions. By contrast, Mattel controlled about 10 to 15% according to Weekly Television Digest. By the end of 1982, there were 2 million Intellivisions in people's homes versus about 16 or 17 million VCSs, according to researcher Michael Current's timeline of Atari history. The Intellivision therefore had various headwinds against it. It cost on average $100 more than the VCS for starters, and its unique control scheme and unusual hardware under the hood made it ill-suited for fast-paced action games. But these weren't the types of games the Intellivision was designed for, with early releases being focused instead on more advanced strategic or sports titles. In that regard, the Intellivision overshadowed its peers remarkably well. In 1981, more action-oriented games started debuting on the platform, cutting into Atari's advantages with the arcade-going crowd, but still the VCS proved a stubborn nut to crack. This led to the reasoning, Bolstorff and Soderman write, that Mattel Electronics could extend into Atari's own market share with VCS-compatible games. In early 1981, Mattel's toy design and development head Richard Chang inquired with Glenn Hightower, head of APH Consulting, about Mattel's interest in making Atari games. Independent of Mattel, APH's designers and developers were responsible for numerous Mattel Electronics products up to that point, including handheld games, the Intellivision's exec operating system, and the act of programming many of the system's early games. Hightower offered to look into reverse engineering the VCS for a price tag, which Mattel declined to pay, but Hightower went ahead with it anyway using Activision's Dragster as his test cart, suspecting that the company would eventually come around. Sure enough, Mattel came back to Hightower in the fall regarding the proposal, with Hightower indicating he could get a lead on it. Days later, Mattel's senior vice president of marketing, Frank O'Connell, received a phone call indicating that the reverse-engineered VCS documentation was now available. Hightower had an associate of his, Ray Feeney, serve as the representative of a group called Analemma, and soon afterwards Mattel had signed a contract for 10 VCS games. This pretty phony degree of separation was a way for APH to see more of the financial benefits from the video game boom, as it was clear Mattel had been underpaying APH for their work thus far on the Intellivision. APH was paid approximately $25,000 to $55,000 per game, according to memos held by the Blue Sky Rangers, and the developers saw a fraction of that. According to the late former Intellivision developer Keith Robinson, the actual programming was done by APH developers who had taken a leave of absence from the company to work on these VCS programs, being paid directly by Hightower. APH developer David Rolfe remarked that it was a heavy crunch job and that the highest priority work that he'd been involved in, but something they went along with because they'd been promised a significant financial windfall. On Mattel's side of things, the company saved some money by reusing the cartridge shells for the Intellivision and developing a little adapter at the end so that they'd fit in the VCS cart slot. At the annual Toy Fair trade show in February, Mattel announced that it was getting into the VCS cartridge game with sophisticated graphics and play. Though the company declined to show anything off at that time, it did insist that these games wouldn't just be clones of Intellivision titles, though Depke said marketing noted which games were selling well on the Intellivision or were otherwise big gaps in the VCS library, and directed the developers to convert them as best they can. Depke indicated that they nevertheless thought that if they could port their bigger hits to the VCS before the Christmas holiday season, Mattel could cut into Atari's pie and do pretty well for itself. With that timeline in mind, the actual debut occurred at the June Consumer Electronics Show, when Mattel announced its M-Network or Mattel Network line as a separate entity from its Intellivision business. And around the end of July, the first 4 of those games shipped, albeit not without some issues. Arcade Express covered a recall of the earliest batch of these games that had issues with the casing and therefore would not fit properly in the original 6-switch VCS unit. Nevertheless, the problem was corrected quickly, and these 4 games didn't seem any worse for wear because of it. You'll also note that most of these games have different names from their Intellivision counterparts, which Depke said was to provide them a degree of differentiation that would suggest the original's title but not make them clearly one-to-one. Arguably, the first game we're looking at was among the most anticipated. It was certainly the most popular, according to an internal Mattel memo tracking the number of games sold to stores and distributors. Super Challenge Football was the best-selling game through June 1983, with 445,800 copies sold. And this is not actually too surprising. The Intellivision was famously well regarded for its sports titles, which featured heavily into the console's head-to-head advertising against the VCS. Atari's own football cartridge was 3 years old by this point as a 1979 release, and while other parts of the console library had grown pretty sophisticated in the years since, sports were an area that Atari had largely been neglecting. Super Challenge Football was written by Ken Smith, who co-wrote the Intellivision NFL football that this was based off of. Smith hasn't talked about his time on the M-Network project, and unfortunately did not respond to my own attempt to ask him about it. Which is too bad, because this is probably one of the best football games of its day. It loses some of the complex play-calling mechanics seen in the Intellivision original, but makes up for it with a clever and effective alternative given the VCS hardware. I've talked a bit about the history of football video games in the Atari Football episode, and brought up NFL football in both that and a separate Intellivision archive one, so I don't want to belabor its story too heavily. Suffice it to say, there were certainly options for football video games available by this point, and some truly excellent ones as seen on the Intellivision or Bally Arcade, but Atari's own football left something to be desired. The VCS hardware and controllers weren't particularly suited for managing a team full of players, and a myriad of different plays that you need to consider before each down. Bob Whitehead managed this in his 1979 release by having you select your plays using one of 4 cardinal directions on the joystick or the button on the controller, with additional variations to allow the computer-controlled players to do something random. Super Challenge Football takes a wholly different tack from Atari's game, of course, and for that matter, NFL Football on the Intellivision. There, you can use the keypad to set your plays. Here, your quarterback or linebacker goes down a line of 4 computer-controlled players, and you use the button or the 4 cardinal directions on the stick to tell each one individually what to do. The manual describes each of these actions, so it is helpful to keep that on hand for reference, but after a while you'll get an idea of what direction causes what action. This is much easier to keep in your head than each press causing your whole team to do something specific, and it is intuitive in a way I'm honestly not used to seeing with a football game of this vintage. Once your teams are set up and everyone is in position, the quarterback kicks things off. If you've identified an individual receiver, done by pressing the red button exactly once while picking your team plays, you have the option to throw the ball to them. Beyond that, this follows the rules of football pretty well, in terms of downs, touchdowns, safeties, and interceptions. And it is actually not that hard to pull off an interception, for that matter. And much like on the Intellivision, there is a wraparound effect in play here. Since the entire football field isn't visible at the same time, a player that goes off one side of the screen warps to the other side, creating the illusion of a larger team than what the game could manage, and giving defenders another shot at tackling the runner. But because of how easy it is to pull off interceptions, and the fact each team is limited to only 5 players, it's actually not that hard to run up some pretty sizable scores, particularly since this rendition of the sport does include all 4 quarters. Even though the timer is faster than an actual clock, it'll still take around 40 minutes to complete a single game, compared to Atari's football, which wraps up in about 5 minutes. All in all, this is a very playable take on the sport that even someone as disinterested in football as myself can find appealing. The controls are easy to grasp, it looks good, has a nice pace to the action, and stays interesting through a play session. The glaring flaw is that it is a 2-player only title, much as Mattel's own sports games often were up to this point. Atari's own football title has a computer opponent, as do later VCS versions, and not having even a poor AI opponent makes this a harder one to play nowadays unless you can recruit someone. But if you do, it is probably one of the best sports games on the platform. To the extent that we have sales records for the M Network releases, Super Challenge Football appears to have been the best seller. An internal Mattel Electronics memo from November 1983 was saved by the Blue Sky Rangers programming group as the subsection of Mattel collapsed in January 1984, and decades later was made available to me. This memo lists the sales of Intellivision and M Network hardware and software to stores through June 1983, albeit not how many sold through to consumers. With this information, we can say Super Challenge Football sold 445,800 units to retailers in that time frame, with 399,000 of those in 1982. This made it the 3rd best-selling M Network title of this first year behind Super Challenge Baseball and Lock 'n' Chase, but it outshipped its brethren by a pretty wide margin in the first half of 1983 to make up that gap. Again, there's no indication of sell-through to consumers here, so it's entirely possible those copies of football were just sitting on shelves in 1983 on through the next few years. But it would not have been unique in that situation. This also doesn't account for sales through the rest of the decade after Mattel Electronics folded. Mattel executive Terry Volesky bought out the rights to the Intellivision, its video games, the M Network library, and the outstanding stock, starting up a mail-order and eventually retail business called INTV, selling older cartridges as well as some new Intellivision titles. Super Challenge Football was among those M Network games that continued to be sold until INTV's stock ran out. Not every game made this late-era lineup, but you can tell those that did by their plain black and white label. Additionally, it should be noted that all 4 games featured in this video were also reissued by publisher Telegames, in both the US and in PAL territories. Telegames was known for selling games for older and orphaned game platforms, especially those that were already finished and were either out of print or went unreleased. And certainly the former was true of M Network games by the late 1980s. Super Challenge Football saw some reasonably positive reviews upon its release. Video Game Update gave it 3 stars for graphics and 2.5 for play in a shared review with Super Challenge Baseball, noting both games are good for sports fans as long as you don't expect the same degree of complexity as the Intellivision versions. Electronic Games wrote it was first-rate, highlighting in particular the play selection process and how the game handles screen scrolling. Joystick gave it 4 stars in its holiday buying guide published in the January 1983 issue, noting that you set plays and run the game much like a real football team. Logical Gamer was unanimous in its appraisal that anyone who likes football would enjoy this cartridge. Famed blackjack player and early video game enthusiast Ken Uston noted that this was one of his favorite video games period, praising how well its play is adapted to the joystick while indicating that it could have used a single-player option. Joyce Worley called it a must-buy for sports fans and Arcade Express, picking out the play selection process in particular. And Electronic Games' Kunkel and Katz indicated it and Super Challenge Baseball were the runners-up in their Best Sports Game of the Year award for the 1982 Arkies, losing to Activision's VCS hockey game. Interestingly, Atari issued its own answer to NFL football months later in December with Real Sports Football that in some way cuts a middle ground between this and the original 1979 cartridge. It echoes the same perspective and team numbers as Super Challenge Football, but includes a computer opponent, decidedly more 1979-era play calling, and fairly short 15-minute play times as the game only runs 1 quarter before being completed. On the flip side, while there are options to kick the ball and pass it, these are more complicated than those seen here with Super Challenge Football, really showing the differing approaches Smith and Rob Zittabel took with their titles. It also feels trickier to actually pass the ball successfully compared to Mattel's offering, but it's hard to complain about a single-player option. And this would end up being the last of the VCS football games until 1989, when Super Football finally made it out the door with a dramatically different visual perspective and even more bells and whistles. But there isn't much sense thinking about a football game that is nearly 7 years away. In July 1982, Super Challenge Football is undisputedly the best football game on the VCS and one of the best console renditions available. Ken Smith did an excellent job on this one and made a truly appealing game. The other sports game Mattel led off with, Super Challenge Baseball, aimed to translate the incredibly popular Major League Baseball to the VCS. It sold only slightly fewer copies than football, clocking in at 444,700 units as of Mattel's last tracking memo. And much like Super Challenge Football, this could at least be partially chalked up to the only other baseball game on the VCS, 1978's Home Run. Home Run is an extremely stripped-down take on baseball, essentially boiling it down to the battle between the pitcher and the fielder. The game ended up using a lot of flicker to function, and base running is effectively automatic. Fielding, such as it is little more than running your pitcher, or pitcher and accompanying fielders, to the ball and then touching the runner. This rudimentary take on the sport wasn't even necessarily the most sophisticated in 1978 when it debuted, but after Mattel published Major League Baseball in 1980, it looked downright archaic. Mattel thought so too, focusing heavily on Home Run versus their own game in their early national ad campaigns. As such, Super Challenge Baseball didn't exactly have the highest bar to clear to become the best baseball game on the platform. Not only did it clear that hurdle, it very successfully translates Major League Baseball's core gameplay to the VCS, a system ill-suited to the sport. Super Challenge Baseball was programmed by David Rolfe, who was also responsible for the Intellivision's own baseball game. Rolfe told me that while baseball was very elaborate, he already had the logic developed from working on Major League Baseball on the Intellivision, and therefore this helped him produce the game far more quickly than he would have without that background experience. He added that he wasn't responsible for designing the graphics on this game, but otherwise programmed it himself, noting that he wasn't sure who did do the graphics for the first wave of M Network titles, but that it was likely someone internal to APH given that these were all done on speculation, without Mattel's knowledge on who the actual developers were. First, what's not here? The shortstop position has been cut. You also don't have the option to bunt the ball while batting, nor do you have to worry about beaning a batter as the pitcher, nor can you get a home run as all hits are grounders. What is here, though, is basically everything else you'd want out of a baseball game. You've got your infielders, your outfielders, the pitcher, the batter, and even the option to steal bases if you set your difficulty switch to A. The rules of the sport are pretty much intact with balls, strikes, outs, stolen bases, and all the passing you could ask for. When pitching, you have a fair bit of control over the ball, being able to adjust its speed and direction in mid-flight. It may not be realistic per se, but it does make this particular aspect of the game pretty dynamic considering it's not that hard to hit the ball. The batter really just needs to get their timing right and also determine if it's worth trying to swing in the first place. When you do hit the ball, the batter starts towards the next base automatically unless you're on difficulty A, in which case you have to do it yourself by pushing right. While that's happening, the fielders need to get the ball to tag the runner. This is a bit less intuitive. You hold the button down and push a cardinal direction either once for infielders or twice for outfielders. This will let you assume control over whichever fielder is blinking. Once you have the ball, it appears over that fielder's head, and the same process is used to identify the target for your throw, which is accomplished by letting go of the button. In the heat of the moment, it's easy to screw this part up and either highlight the wrong fielder in the first place or the wrong target for the ball. Either way, once things have settled in, you can simply throw the ball back to the pitcher with the stick in neutral and continue the game. The pitcher can optionally throw the ball to one of the bases at any given time during pitching, in case you want to try and catch someone trying to steal. The manual also recommends assuming control of the pitcher after a hit, as their central location makes them well suited for catching the ball. Much as with Super Challenge Football, Super Challenge Baseball runs a full 9 innings, which can take about 30 to 40 minutes. Obviously, this game loses more from the conversion to VCS hardware than NFL football did, as Major League Baseball and the Intellivision featured fly balls, home runs, shortstops, and pretty granular control thanks to the Intellivision controller's own unique features. But this isn't too surprising, as Major League Baseball was essentially the original game designed on that console, and was the game its exec operating system was designed concurrently with. You couldn't ask for a console designed for baseball more than the Intellivision was, whereas here Rolf was trying to cram the sport into a game system even less suited for this than it was for football. Super Challenge Baseball lacks a one-player mode like that seen in Home Run, but it improves upon it in pretty much every other aspect. These adjustments for the VCS version were noted in contemporary reviews. The Video Game Update had its shared review with Super Challenge Football with the same overall notes, though they did add that the case of Super Challenge Baseball, that Atari's Home Run does have a single-player option. Electronic Fun with Computers and Games ran a review by Susan Prince, who gave it 2 joysticks. She wrote that it was more than adequate for a game player, even if not on par with Intellivision's Major League Baseball, though sending the center fielder after the ball was surprisingly tricky. In Arcade Express, Joyce Worley wrote it was the best baseball game on the VCS, if not quite as good as Super Challenge Football was. Logical Gamer gave it high praise, noting that if you have a VCS and like baseball, and maybe even if you don't, this was an enjoyable cart. Joystick gave this one 4 stars in its holiday buying guide, noting that the controls may be tricky to master, but that the graphics are clean and detailed. Electronic Games covered the game in its roundup of video baseball games from August 1983, considering it an excellent adaptation of the Intellivision game, even if the control scheme takes some getting used to. The ever-irreverent Vidiot, on the other hand, wrote that players must already know baseball fundamentals for the game to be tolerable, complaining about the fielding, the automatic base running, and the lack of depth to batting. Video Gaming Illustrated did indicate it tied for first place in its ranking of Best VCS Sports Game, both on the first ballot and on an attempted tiebreaker, alongside Atari's Real Sports Baseball. This is rather impressive, as Real Sports Baseball effectively improves on Super Challenge Baseball in some capacities. Released in October, this version of the sport has fly balls, home runs, bunting, and admittedly another complicated control scheme. But it also features a computer opponent, which is pretty great, but it's also hard to bat properly, as judging whether or not the ball will be in the strike zone and the exact timing for your swing is much harder than Super Challenge Baseball. The manual even says that whether or not a pitch is a ball or a strike is randomized, with the percentage based on the type of pitch thrown. Fielding is significantly less confusing, much to my appreciation, but ultimately it comes down to preferences between these two. Super Challenge Baseball was undisputedly the best-selling M Network title of 1982, shipping 421,200 units that year. Interestingly, the memo gives us some clues into units coming back to Mattel in 1983. The memo lists a year-to-date through May and another through June, and Super Challenge Baseball is marked down as having shipped 23,800 units in the May slot, but 23,500 by the end of June, indicating that Mattel saw approximately 300 copies returned. All of Mattel's 1982 VCS releases, save for Super Challenge Football and Tron Deadly Discs, saw this same situation. And Super Challenge Baseball is certainly not the worst to get hit on this front, but it's a sign as to the headwinds the entire industry was facing and the conditions that helped nearly bankrupt Mattel. All told, the memo concludes with Super Challenge Baseball's sales figures at 444,700 units, which is respectable, but at that rate of attrition, probably not where things remained by the end. Like Super Challenge Football, Super Challenge Baseball also continued to be sold into the INTV era with a black and white label, and of course, through Telegames. The same cannot be said for the following 2 games we'll be looking at in this video. Astro Blast is the pure action game Mattel put forth as part of its M Network effort, hitting the space shooter category that had exploded in popularity at the time. It's also a port of Mattel's extremely popular Intellivision shooter Astro Smash, which had debuted about 9 months earlier in November 1981. Astro Smash was the biggest non-sports hit on the platform, selling just shy of 1 million copies to storefronts. And at the time this port debuted, Mattel was gearing up for a national high-score competition for the original, even going so far as to offer a free copy to Intellivision console buyers earlier in the year. Astro Smash admittedly didn't have much competition for space-themed shooters, or indeed any kind of shooters when it came out on the Intellivision. Space Armada, a Space Invaders clone, and early release Space Battle were pretty much it. Astro Smash differentiates itself from either of those in how well considered its mechanics are. Yes, it's a vertical shooter where objects are falling from the sky towards you, and yes, some of them are actively trying to kill you. But it also hands out lives like candy every 1,000 points, with big score multipliers coming into play as you move further into the game. But also, if most objects hit the ground, you also lose points. Space rocks are the most common targets, and big ones tend to split apart when shot akin to Atari's own asteroids. Which makes sense when you consider Astro Smash was intended as a secondary game in what was planned to be the Intellivision answer to asteroids. You also have to watch for spinners, which will kill you if they touch the ground, guided pulsar missiles that track you, and alien UFOs that fire targeted shots at you. Every time you hit a scoring milestone, the game gets more difficult, topping out when you hit 1 million points. Coupled with a fairly dynamic difficulty curve that slows the game down when you lose several lives in a row, mostly due to your score dropping each time, and you have a title that really encourages you to play aggressively in the knowledge that you can get pretty far before your stockpile of lives is really depleted. The Intellivision wasn't really designed for fast action, but it does an admirable job with Astro Smash. So what happens when you bring a game like that to a console that is designed around fast action? You get Astro Blast, a significantly more intense experience that not only translates well to the VCS, but might actually surpass the original. The late developer Hal Finney told Scott Stilfen in a 2006 interview that he really didn't remember anything specific about its development as beyond hammering out his VCS conversions within a few weeks for each. But him being unfortunately slammed at the time does not take anything away from what he accomplished here. The scoring targets aren't quite the same, but a similar progression occurs, including UFOs starting to appear once you hit 20,000 points. All the enemy targets have translated over admirably, with the only real change being made to pulsar missiles. On the Intellivision, these can land on the ground and continue chasing you down, which forces you to use the hyperspace function to escape getting destroyed. Since hyperspace was cut out of the VCS port, the missiles now just land on the ground and vanish. But without hyperspace, you may think, how do you make up for that lack of mobility? Hal Finney had you covered. Astro Blast supports both the standard joystick and the paddle controllers. The joystick functionality is probably what most people are familiar with, as that is pretty standard for these kinds of games on the VCS, but the paddle makes it truly a delight to play. You can fling yourself across the screen to catch your target or avoid danger in a way that you cannot with the joystick. Paddle controls have never been terribly standard for the shooter genre, but between this and the Nintendo DS Space Invaders Extreme titles, maybe it should have been. Astro Blast is a pretty good game with the joystick, but absolutely shines with paddle controls. Most of the play options have carried over from the Intellivision release as well. The left difficulty switch controls whether or not you have auto-fire on, a concession made on the Intellivision presumably for its funky controller design, but very welcome here as well. Meanwhile, the right switch can be set to difficulty A to max out the game's challenge immediately, as though your score was over 50,000 points. The Intellivision also had a pause function, which the VCS does not include per se, but after a death the game does not pick back up until you press the controller button, giving you a chance to take a break. This is also welcome, as while the Intellivision game takes quite a while to really ramp up in difficulty, the VCS one puts you in the hot seat very quickly. The fact that objects drop so much more smoothly on the VCS makes it all that much harder to keep up with the swarm, even if everything else has to clear off the screen when a UFO comes in. I wouldn't say either game is immensely difficult compared to some of their brethren, but they're dynamic enough to stay fairly fun the whole way through. This is really borne out in the reviews at its release too. Video Game Update gave it 3 stars for graphics and 3.5 for play, remarking it as a faster game than Astro Smash with greater accuracy requirements, and one that would appeal to the space cadets out there. Electronic Fun with Computers and Games gave it 3 joysticks, with the reviewer actually considering it too much faster than Astro Smash at the jump and hard to keep up with. And the loss of hyperspace was particularly jarring for them. Video Games gave it a brief write-up, highlighting the paddle controller option in particular, and praising its simplistic, fun concept. Joystick gave it 3 stars, remarking that it was even more fun than Astro Smash, and the Logical Gamers reviewers were split, with one finding it both it and Astro Smash rather boring, and the other enjoying it as sharing all the intensity of its originator. Astro Blast sold to retailers about 380,400 copies in 1982. Admirable, but putting it pretty much in the center of M-Network sales. Didn't really make up that gap in 1983 either, and was in fact another game that saw returns between May and June. Of the 14,800 copies sold to retail through May, about 4,100 were returned over the course of that following month, with it ending its recorded run at about 391,100 copies. The gap between its performance on the Intellivision compared to the VCS likely had to do with the fact that the competition was much fiercer for space shooters on the VCS. And at the time this had come out, you also had titles like Demon Attack, Space Cavern, Atlantis, and Atari's own releases taking up space. There's also the matter of timing, as video games were extremely hot in 1981, and by the middle of 1982, there was an industry expectation that a shakeout was coming. But don't let the middling sales fool you. Astro Blast is a real gem of a game in an M Network lineup that is generally pretty high quality. It's still fun to play today, and while the Astro Smash game rights may have been split from the rest of the Mattel Electronics video games due to the Amico debacle, Astro Blast was unaffected. As of this recording, it should even be part of the Atari 50 collection along with the rest of the M Network games, and I definitely encourage you to check it out, especially if you can rig up a paddle controller. Our final game this video is Space Attack, a VCS conversion of Intellivision's Space Battle, and despite a real downgrade in the audio visuals and an awkward translation of the controller scheme, Space Battle is a remarkably well-done take on the original. The original Space Battle debuted in 1980 as essentially the sole space game on the Intellivision, and probably the closest thing on the system to a fast action title. Based off the TV series Battlestar Galactica, but renamed when the rights fell through. Space Battle was split between two game modes. To start, you have a zoomed out scanner view that initially shows squadrons of alien ships heading towards the center, where your mothership is located. From there you use the keypad to launch your own squadrons of 3 fighters each, at whichever alien group you want them to head towards. Once one of them intercepts their target, you can switch to a cockpit mode, where you aim a targeting reticule at alien fighters as they dodge and weave across the screen, firing back at you. If the shots hit your reticule, you lose one of your own fighters. All the while, if you're not on the easiest difficulty level, events are still playing out in the broader world at half speed, and if the computer is left to fly on and operate the other squadrons, they'll steadily lose a fighter for every so many alien ships destroyed. As such, winning Space Battle requires strategy as to when you send a squadron after the aliens and which ones, to try and minimize how much overlap they have, as well as playing well enough to not get wiped out. If enemy fighters reach the center, an alarm starts sounding as they do damage to your mothership, with the speed of the attack increasing based on how many surviving aliens are surrounding you. Alternately, you can win by wiping out all the alien squadrons. It's not quite Star Raiders, which came out after development for this game seemingly was completed, but it's unique and was one of the best-selling titles on the Intellivision. Accordingly, it found its way into the first wave of VCS releases. All of these aspects of the game carry over magnificently to the VCS. Their graphics aren't quite as pretty, and the alien fighters don't really have any animation to speak of, but Space Attack plays pretty closely to its counterpart. In lieu of the keypad, and perhaps not surprisingly to anyone who has made it this far into the video, Space Attack handles the targeting of alien fighter groups and the selection of squadrons with combinations of the joystick and button. Pushing down on the joystick will flip your targeting between alien squadrons, and to launch fighters at one, you hold down the button and press left, right, or up for the blue, gold, and white squadrons, respectively. To enter battle mode once you've made your interception, you just press that direction on the joystick without pressing the button. To redirect fighters to another enemy group, you just follow the same procedure of highlighting them and pressing the button and stick together. There are 2 key differences between this and Space Battle. The first would be the number of enemies. Space Battle involved 5 alien squadrons, and Space Attack adds a 6th one, probably to make the game a bit harder. Secondly, once you get into battle mode, you're committed until one side or the other is wiped out. Space Attack lets you use the keypad to leave a fight, to redirect your squadron elsewhere, or to handle another situation. With no keypad, this was cut, as was the command to send a squadron right back to the center of the radar map. Presumably this wasn't terribly necessary other than for repositioning. These changes mean that you have to be even more mindful of how you're handling the strategic portions of the game, particularly if you've set the right difficulty switch to A, which causes all activity to continue while you're in battle at a quarter speed. The left difficulty switch increases the combat ability of the enemy ships, making their shots twice as fast while also making them fly more erratically and fire more frequently. This usage of the difficulty switches is rather welcome, as one issue the original Space Battle had was its challenge level. While it was quickly revised to add an additional difficulty level, the VCS version really only has 2. Both switches on difficulty B makes for a frankly pretty toothless session once you understand how to play the game. In contrast, dealing with the ongoing timescales forces more strategy, and the shots come fast enough on difficulty A that you can feasibly lose some of your fighters, and possibly the game. This and Super Challenge Baseball struggled in particular to translate the more complex control schemes than the VCS is designed around, but once you get past the hurdle of operating the radar screen, this is a pretty fun, short little game. Space Attack's reception is a bit more mixed than the other games featured here. Video Games gave it a fairly positive write-up, praising its challenge and graphics, but noting that the alien ships don't really have a 3D effect like their shots do, and therefore it doesn't really measure up to the standards set by Star Voyager and Star Master. Video Game Update gave it a solid 3 stars for graphics and 3.5 for play, finding it very engaging once you get the hang of the controls. Electronic Fun with Computers and Games found the radar mode confusing and the battle mode entertaining, but not terribly challenging. Joystick gave it 2 stars, noting that the other Star Raiders-esque games do better with the same theme. That said, the game still did pretty well for itself. Of these initial 4 VCS titles, Space Attack had the least amount of sales in 1982, but still saw a respectable 371,700 units sent along to stores. It did not, however, see a lot of new sales in 1983. An additional 17,300 by May, which shifted downward to 13,700 through June, thanks to returns. All told, Space Attack ended its recorded sales period at 385,400 copies. Though as noted, it did return to retail in the late 1980s through a reissue by Telegames, along with these other 3. M-Network really represented Mattel's recognition of the realities of the home console market. The VCS represented a massive chunk of machines in people's homes, and it was unlikely that the Intellivision with its higher price tag could significantly dent it. But that didn't mean there wasn't still money to be made either with their own console or by piggybacking off of Atari's install base. It's a dynamic you see again now with Microsoft games showing up on other platforms. And it's also one we'll see again going forward. Coleco's re-entry into the home console space involved releasing games on the VCS and Intellivision, in addition to its ColecoVision console. North American Philips got underway on developing games for competitors to their Odyssey 2. And even Atari will begin selling games for its competitors at the tail end of 1983. Home video games were a much messier industry at this time with few restrictions regarding making and selling games as a third party, and you can't fault Mattel for trying to take advantage of that. Depke said that while ports from the Intellivision to the VCS were pretty straightforward to decide to move ahead on, going forward, original software for either platform was considered on each console's strengths and merits. Something we won't necessarily see a ton of in 1982, but will become a notable factor as we get into the 1983 lineup of M-Network titles. Next time, The King of Kong.